My name's John Spinelli. I'm a researcher at BC Cancer Agency in Vancouver, British Columbia, Canada, and also a professor at the University of British Columbia. I've been a member of Interlymph almost since the beginning, as one of the reasons to join Interlymph was that I did a case control study of non-Hodgkin lymphoma, looking at environmental and genetic risk factors. And Interlymph is a way for investigators doing research to get together, discuss projects, pull data to improve our ability to look at risk factors, and basically to support each other in our work. A pesticide is basically any agent that is meant to deter or kill pests, and they can be synthetic or natural. And the two main types of pesticides are either insecticides, which are meant to deal with insects, and even more commonly now, herbicides, which are meant to deal with agricultural pests such as weeds. So, of course, pesticides have long been concern about their health and environmental effects from the 1960s, when it was identified that many of the pesticides that are being used, such as DDT, were harming the environment and animals. And the question was, did it also have an adverse effect on humans? And so in the 1970s, pesticides started to be considered as whether they're carcinogenic or not. And the very early studies looked primarily at occupations, and very consistently, one of the findings is that farmers have a higher risk of non-Hodgkin lymphoma than other occupations. And that led researchers to speculate what that might be, and there was some thoughts of animal exposures, but I think overwhelmingly the major suspected factor was the use of pesticides, because farmers were using, especially in those days, a lot of pesticides. So non-Hodgkin lymphoma was a major type of cancer that was studied for pesticide use because of that link with farmers. And in fact, my study, looking at risk factors for non-Hodgkin lymphoma, was really concentrating on identifying pesticides. I've done several studies looking at possible pesticide association. Now, that being said, there actually haven't been that many pesticides that have been conclusively linked with cancer, including non-Hodgkin lymphoma. There's an organization called IARC, the International Agency for Research in Cancer, that basically reviews substances or agents or occupations to determine whether there is a causal link with cancer. And they've reviewed on the order of 16 pesticides since 1970s, and only 3 really have been named as definitely able to be named as a carcinogen. So of the three that pesticides that have been found to be causal for cancer, we say carcinogenic. Arsenic pesticides and lindane, which is a type of organochlorine insecticide, have both been named as carcinogens, and they've both been banned. So really that kind of evaluation has led to changes which we hope reduce the risk of lymphoma. There have been a number of other pesticides that are classified as probable carcinogens, and that's a bit of a difficult word to understand even for people who work in the field, but what it means is there's animal evidence or cell evidence that these substances can cause cancer, but there's really not much evidence in humans. And that doesn't mean that we know there's no risk in humans, it's just that there's not enough to say conclusively that they are carcinogens for people. The 3 pesticides that they reviewed and determined there was enough evidence to call them probable carcinogens were insecticides malathion and diazinon that are still in use but very limited use, and a herbicide known as glyphosate. And in particular, the glyphosate categorization has been quite controversial. There's been a lot of discussion of the process and whether it was reasonable to name it as a probable carcinogen. Other agencies have said it's safe, so there is some disagreement among the experts whether glyphosate is a cause of non-Hodgkin lymphoma. But one thing that's really important to understand is that when we say that there's evidence of increased risk in humans, almost all of the research is done in people who actually apply pesticides. That's where the largest exposure is. That's where we can identify an increased risk, such as farmers, for example, or landscapers, or people who work in forestry and spray herbicides. So that's, with the exception of a few pesticides that are very long lasting, such as DDT, we don't think that the kind of levels that we get either from the environment or in diet really have much effect on non-Hodgkin lymphoma. So the bottom line is not to worry too much about whether there's pesticides on food because they're very low levels, or whether your neighbor is using glyphosate, because it's unlikely to give you a large exposure. But if you do use pesticides, clearly we only want to use them if there's a real need. For instance, in Vancouver now, the cosmetic use of pesticides is not allowed, is illegal. But if there's a need for it, if you have an infestation of termites in your house, then it's okay to use an insecticide. And also, if you do use them, to really be safe, use them as directed. Make sure you wear protective equipment, and make sure children aren't exposed, because even though most of the evidence we have is in adults, there's a real suspicion that children are going to be more susceptible to any adverse health effect. So keeping children away is very important.